Good evening, and a very warm welcome to each and every one of you to St. Paul's as we come to the last evening in our autumn forum series, exploring how to change the world, and tonight focusing on togetherness. My name is Mark Oakley, and it is my privilege to have been chairing the series, and of course welcoming and introducing our speakers to you, which I will do in just a moment. I would, however, first especially like to welcome, although I've just been told they're about 2 or 3 minutes away, a delegation of members of the Tibetan Parliament in exile. They're coming here, and don't be alarmed when they probably are led to the seats down here on the front row. But they are exceptionally welcome, as well as friends from the Tutu Foundation UK and also from Occupy Faith, who have brought some artwork exploring the themes of this evening, which are on display on the table over there, and for which we are very grateful. For those of you who haven't been to one of our events here before, let me just quickly explain how it works. In a moment, Michael Battle and Rowan Williams will speak about how we can begin together to change our world, our communities and our lives. And as they speak, if you have a question, please at any stage write it on the back of your leaflet, hold it up, and it will be collected. We ask you to write down your questions like that because although we love the dome here, it does swallow up, as you can probably hear, even with this microphone, sound that's made under it. We'll collect questions throughout the evening until about 7:30, and please make sure as you write it down that it's brief and legible. We can always spot the GPs amongst you. They'll all appear before me up here on the screen, and then I'll be able to put as many of them as I can to the speakers. We'll end promptly at 8, and then books from the speakers in the whole series will be for sale here under the dome, and both of tonight's speakers will very kindly sign copies of their own books. There'll also be a chance for you to donate as you leave tonight to the Tutu Foundation UK, an organisation doing fantastic work building peace and understanding between peoples of different ethnic, religious and cultural backgrounds in the UK. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers. Michael Battle is a theologian and a priest, a well-known writer, speaker and retreat leader, much in demand all over the world, to speak on a Christian understanding of non-violence, peacemaking, transformation, and spirituality. He was ordained by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, having lived and worked with him for 2 years in South Africa, which he says was fundamental to his formation, being number 2 to Tutu, I suppose. He has since served in a number of highly distinguished roles, among other things as canon theologian for the Diocese of Los Angeles, associate professor at Duke University, academic dean of the Virginia Theological Seminary, and chaplain to both the Episcopal House of Bishops and the 2008 Lambeth Conference, and also vice chair of the Gandhi Institute, run by Mahatma Gandhi's grandson, Aaron. His many books include Ubuntu, I in You and You in Me, and Reconciliation, the Ubuntu theology of Desmond Tutu. Michael, you're very welcome here this evening. Rowan Williams was the Archbishop of Canterbury until the 31st of December last year, and is now, I suspect, very much enjoying being the Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge. In fact, it is rumoured that he is seen skipping down the streets of Cambridge towards Tesco occasionally without a care in the world. He managed and bore the trials, and I hope some joys, as well of being Archbishop, with such grace that at the end of serving office, the General Synod, to his evident embarrassment, gave him a standing ovation, and that was something that was repeated from one end of the church to the other. He is quite apart from this a transformative theologian, a poet, teacher, and translator, and the author of a dizzying number of books on practically everything, from Dostoevsky to the Resurrection, by way of Narnia, the Desert Fathers and Mothers, the Arian Heresy, and numerous other things. Formidably gifted, he also manages to be amazingly unformidable. Not all archbishops could be the inspiration for their cathedral's best-selling tribute, Teddy Bear, as he was. And to be personal for just a moment, and I can now say these things, of course, without looking as if I'm trying to get a job. I remember a conversation I had with him about Flannery O'Connor's book, Mystery and Manners. Those two words summarize for me something very deep down in him, an inquisitive, serious but playful dive towards the mystery of God, and a relentless attempt to have the manner of life and speech that upholds the non-negotiable dignity of all those made in the image of that mystery, no matter how much they disagree with you, dislike you, or disappoint you. Such people in this world will always carry wounds, but this graced humaneness of Rowan Williams has taught me that as a Christian, our duty is always to dispel illusions, but without becoming disillusioned, to think critically and to try to live faithfully. And it's a great honor to have both he and Michael with us here tonight. And now I invite Michael to speak to us.
I'd like to thank you, Mark, for such a wonderful introduction and for inviting me into this forum of how to change the world. I want to echo your wonderful remarks about Archbishop Rowan, someone I've admired for much of my life, and an honor to share this forum with. How we can change the world, especially in this context of how do we do that together, I want to offer some frames of reference, and the chief frame of reference is an African concept called Ubuntu, and I want to offer some benefits that are hard for us in the Western world to appreciate. So the first frame of reference is actually some humor, but it's helping to set the stage for why I think we change the world together. There were three sons who came into a large amount of money. They got together, and the first one said, "I'm going to buy Mom a big house." The second one said, I'm going to do you one better. I'm going to buy her the most expensive car on the planet and hire a driver. And the third one said, "No, I've got all of you beat. There's an African parrot that has been trained by these wise, spiritual Christian leaders to know every chapter and verse in the Bible. And they took 12 years to train this parrot. And all Mom has to do is name a chapter and a verse, and the parrot will recite it." Well, the mom received these gifts and wrote 3 thank you letters. "Dear Gerald, the house is too big. Thank you for your intentions, but I'm too old to clean it. Dear Ronald, I can't drive anymore because of medical reasons, and the driver is so rude, but thank you for your intentions. Dear John, you've always been my favorite child. You've always known what I've wanted. The chicken was delicious. This first frame of reference is about gift. We often need to be trained in the appreciation of gift. And I think and believe that the greatest gift is the other. But for us, I would argue, and I consider myself a Western person, being an African American, it's very difficult to see the other as a gift. I think we also have to be trained in seeing otherness, difference, as giftedness. You don't just receive a gift, you have to train yourself to place it, value it, appreciate it, know its texture, know its meaning. Ironically, gift takes work. The second frame of reference is an African concept similar to the need to work towards the giftedness of others. It's called Ubuntu. I'm happy to report that it's becoming more popular in the world. Archbishop Tutu and President Nelson Mandela are some of the most famous articulators of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is really a frame of reference that comes from the Bantu peoples of sub-Saharan Africa. For us, it is superficially defined as community. But for us in the Western world, it's difficult for us to know the depth of Ubuntu because our definitions of Ubuntu are usually affinity groups or an aggregation of individuals. It's very difficult for us to get to the deeply textured meaning of Ubuntu. There's a proverb that helps us to some extent. And the proverb is, a person is a person through other persons. That identity is interdependently known. So Ubuntu is community, but it's the kind of community in which identity is formed through community. Even goes to a point for Western ears that's difficult to hear, that my identity is dependent upon yours. And Ubuntu is in contrast to the Western European Enlightenment ways of seeing self, especially through the Western great proverb of, I think, therefore I am. For Ubuntu, it's different. I am because we are. And because we are, I am. The frame of reference for us for Ubuntu is similar to the mother eating the parrot. It's very difficult for us to appreciate this African frame of reference because sometimes it smells like dysfunction. How could I be dependent on another? That seems dysfunctional, codependence. But I would argue that Ubuntu gives us entree into answering this question of how to change the world together. And then lastly, because of my own vocation as a Christian, I think Ubuntu can be seen in religion. And because of my own context, I see it particularly in Christian faith. Jesus, for example, says, wherever 2 or 3 gather, I am there in their midst. Matthew chapter 18. Now I'm sounding like the African parrot. And then St. Paul in Romans chapter 12 says, for as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function, so we who are many are one body, and individually we are members of one another. That's Ubuntu. And someone more expert at articulating what I'm about to say is sitting here. The very concept of God is Ubuntu. The very persons of God, the way that there is one substance, one God, is because of the relationality that a person is a person through the persons of God. So the frames of reference that I've mentioned, I think are all shaped by the landscape of the framework that comes from Africa of Ubuntu. Now, the benefits in closing. I think Ubuntu, if we're going to think about how we can change the world together, Ubuntu is not some simple utopian way of seeing the world. I think there are actually measurable benefits to Ubuntu, and I want to name 3. First, I think Ubuntu helps religion. All of us know that religion has often gotten in the way of helping us to change the world beneficially. But I think especially for Christian religion, Ubuntu offers a frame of reference not to simply long for personal salvation. Ubuntu invites us into the deeper mysteries that, as a Christian, I cannot be a Christian alone. It offers the mysteries of Archbishop Tutu, one of his latest books, God is Not a Christian. It offers the wisdom that I learned in one of Archbishop Rowan's classes when I was his student at Yale. We were worried about this Russian theologian, I think it was Nicholas Berdyaev, I'm not sure, but this Russian theologian was worried about heaven. How could he be in heaven conscious of someone weeping, someone gnashing their teeth? How could he be fully satisfied, completely full of all that could contain his need, knowing, conscious of someone who was suffering? How could he existentially be in heaven, knowing someone else, the other, is in hell? And I doubt you remember, Rowan, but I raised a hand in the class at that day and I said, well, you know, some people's concept of heaven is based upon people being in hell. The joy, the knowledge of knowing that an enemy is suffering brings enjoyment to some people. But Ubuntu doesn't allow that frame of reference. It doesn't simply articulate a personal salvation. It articulates a salvation in which I am dependent on your salvation to be saved. And I think this goes a long way in ecumenical and interreligious ways in which we can have conversations. The second benefit is, I think, from social science. Social science now is able to measure a person's health more so than pharmaceuticals and in many cases, doctor's visits simply by looking at who your friends are, looking at if you are in community. They're able to measure a person's physical health based upon their communal way of being. They can measure your blood pressure, your cholesterol levels, your resilience to addictions, your ability to eat right and have the right body mass and weight, simply by measuring if you are in community. Looking to see if those who are around you are also have good blood pressure and good cholesterol levels. The ways that we are socially interacted creates health. Even our social scientists are saying today. That's Ubuntu. And then I think lastly, the benefit is political, and you could even say economic. If we're trying to answer the question, how can we change the world together, oftentimes we hide behind the excuse of saying that I'm not a saint or I'm not a hero. But it is an excuse, and I've heard many people say it, that I'm not Mother Teresa or I'm not Nelson Mandela. But I think Ubuntu teaches us a great deal about political interaction. And I use a case study of South Africa, from which Ubuntu has been articulated the most from these days. South Africa produced a political experiment unlike any other nation state has done. They produced the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There have been other commissions similar to it. They've had some in Chile and El Salvador, Panama, but those have mostly been truth commissions. And the amnesty has not been true amnesty. But South Africa has produced a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think it comes from that framework of Ubuntu, in which the leaders of that country got together and made decisions that they did not want perpetual war. They did not want South Africa to be a Middle East. They made decisions that they would practice not retributive justice, but restorative justice, that they would practice a way of bringing affinity groups together and ways in which there could be a reference point for those from different and even violent points of view. That political experiment has been replicated in other parts of the world. And I think it shows us ways in which we can practice longevity and quality of existence through political interactions. In closing, I think if we want to do Ubuntu, if we want to practice it, and most of all appreciate it, there has to be a way in which we do that together. And as Western people, I even claim we can do it as well. We know in our hearts we cannot be a person by ourselves. It's obvious. We know in our hearts that if we're going to change the world, there has to be the interaction of gifts. There has to be the way in which something is greater than the sum of our parts. And I think that's why we're here.
Thank you, Michael.
Rather, as I feared, Michael has already said all the important things there are to say on this subject, and you'll have to bear with just a few academic footnotes from a newly reconstructed academic. I'd like to begin with just two brief comments arising out of things you said, Michael. One is actually to go back to that moment in Yale 23 years ago. I think if you'd asked me about that now, I would have said that the person who believes they are in heaven and is relishing the loss or suffering of another is probably in hell without noticing it. The second is to pick up one of those elements in a much older tradition that has helped Christians make some sense of the Ubuntu concept that you outline. And it's something that comes from a Greek Christian writer of the second Christian century, who asks, what is it that's distinctive about the love of God? The love of God is love that does not arise just out of having things in common, he replies. God doesn't love us because we have so much in common with God. On the contrary, we are finite, God is infinite. We are a mess, God isn't. Spell it out however you like. But the point is that God's love creates common life. It doesn't arise out of a common life we already have. And the challenge, I think, in what you've said, and the challenge in the whole of this enterprise, is how do we build common life with those we think we have nothing in common with? How do we love creatively? It was Jesus, after all, who said that it's perfectly easy to love people like you. Everybody does that. What is new about the gospel is an energy and a power that allows us, enables us to love those who are not like us and whom we may not like. But those are just two immediate responses to the things you were outlining. And I'd like, in the rest of this brief presentation, just to say a little bit more about some of those essential themes which you, Michael, have outlined for us. And I want to cast it in terms of the crucial importance for us of challenging mythology. Some years ago, the philosopher Mary Midgley wrote a wonderful book called The Myths We Live By. And she concentrated in that book very largely on the myths, the stories we tell ourselves about human independence from creation. We tell ourselves the story that we are not actually part of this world. A story about the independence of what goes on in our heads. A story about our freedom from an environment that we can do what we like with. But that kind of mythology is really only another version of the poisonous mythology that tells us that we're not even dependent on other human subjects. So one of the first myths that has to be challenged and dissolved is that myth that the ideal condition for human beings is non-connectedness. Non-connectedness with one another, non-connectedness with the environment. Some of you may know that there is a movement, mostly in the United States, I'm sorry to say, which is about transhumanity, liberating humanity from the constraints of flesh and blood, making ourselves immortal. It's an idea that has, of course, been thought of before, notably in the Garden of Eden, where it wasn't a very conspicuous success, and I'm not holding my breath for it to be any more successful in our age. But how very interesting that people should present to themselves and to the rest of us an ideal of disconnection, as if the one thing we most wanted was not to be where we are who we are and what we are. Not to be in this time-bound world. Not to be the products of a history of interaction. Not to be the flesh and blood we literally are. And that particular mythology that idealizes disconnection is in fact at the root of a great many of our problems. And it doesn't take too much imagination to see how it plays out in a number of particular settings. The myth that we are or should be independent of our environment is now one which I think has been undermined pretty solidly by a lot of what's been going on in the last couple of decades. We're obliged to recognize more and more fully how bound up we are in the life of a planet of limited resources. We're obliged to recognize that the damage we do to the life of this planet is, in the not very long run, damage we do to our life. Similarly, a great deal of our financial crisis in the last few years has been connected to this myth of disconnection. People have wanted to uncouple the business of money-making from the serious and risky business of making things, including relationships, transacting with others about the world we share. And what seems to have taken us over in the last few years is a massive set of fictions about our economic life, as if it had no connection with things and persons, as if it were all about generating a series of noughts out of nothing. We need to do quite a lot of challenging of mythologies in the financial world that imagine there is an ideal state of wealth creation or profit making that has no connection with risk or relationship or actual physical reality. Why is it that we are more preoccupied, it seems, with rising house prices than with building houses? That, to my mind, crystallizes the problem at its heart. But it connects with that longing for unconnectedness. It's also, of course, something that shows itself in our corporate and individual impatience. We don't like taking time. We don't like recognizing that there are some processes in individual and shared life which simply take the time that they take. Richard Sennett, the LSE, has written a wonderful book called The Craftsman, in which he discusses those kinds of human activity which can only be themselves when they take time. And the time they take, the learning of a craft, is a time of connection where you gradually learn the contours, the way of being, of the stuff around you, and learn how your life can absorb that and express that connection in craft and in art. Time-taking has a lot to do with putting our immediate lust for gratification on the back burner. And that means having the freedom and the intelligence and the imagination to look at our immediate emotional state and say that's not all there is. And once we've learned to look at our immediate emotional state and say that's not all there is, we are open to learning, the learning that our environment imposes on us, the learning that our relationships impose on us, the learning of how to be intelligent in our emotions, not to block off our emotions, but to be intelligent in our feeling. And we're not very good at that. So I think that one of the implications of the Ubuntu model, I am because we are, is that we need to be puncturing these fictions which so dominate us. So often we hear people talking about the real world and the pressures of the real world in finance and relationship and all sorts of things. And I feel increasingly that this much discussed real world is more and more an illusory one, and that our most urgent need is to reconnect with our bodies, our limits, our dependence, our mutuality. All that we say and think is a cooperative venture. No child would develop a concept of the world without conversation. And at whatever point in our lives we find ourselves, learning what the world truly is depends very deeply on our willingness for conversation, which needn't be complacent or easy or convergent, can sometimes be bitterly hard work. But we do it because of a sense that we need, literally, the perspective of the other for us to be ourselves. We're supposed to be thinking in these sessions about how we change the world. A very modest ambition. And I thought that before I finished, I might just stick my neck out and venture one or two thoughts about areas where some not vastly complicated changes might open up new possibilities for us. And in good sermonic fashion, I'll just give you three. First is, I still believe, in spite of being walloped for this by the Financial Times, among others, that some sort of financial transaction tax is one of the ways in which we can express more effectively the realities as opposed to the fictions of our economic life. I'm not an economist, as many people have told me over the years, but maybe just because of that, I'm allowed to make a stupid suggestion and see where it goes. But I do believe that that still needs work, and that at least discussing it brings into focus some of the fictions that are most toxic for us at the moment. Second thing is connected with the Millennium Development Goals and where exactly we hope to see those going after 2015. And again, it sounds quite simple. It's not quite so easy to put into practice, but it is a basic thing. And that is the education of women. Right across the world, in any and every culture, one of the most transforming things that can happen is the education of girls and women. They are, in so many contexts, and Michael, you'll know this from Africa as I do, in so many contexts, a woman given the freedom to take control of the circumstances in which she lives is a uniquely effective agent of transformation, actually delivering development at grassroots, in education, in healthcare, in microfinance. And I hope and pray that we don't lose sight of that as one of the major elements in our Millennium Development Goals. And it connects with what I was saying earlier, because of course one of the most damaging myths that we can perpetrate is that somehow the voice of half the human race doesn't matter. That the experience of half the human race can be disregarded at the level of decision-making and, indeed, myth-making? Can we in some way keep that in focus as a clear priority, with all that it involves in challenging the appalling record of gender-based violence across the world? And finally, I mentioned Mary Midgley's Myths We Live By and some of the issues about the environment that we're facing. Finally, another simple and difficult thought: how do we actually attain global coordination over climate change? How do we create and sustain a coherent international response? Thus far, it's not been impressive. There have been attempts, worthy attempts, patchily successful attempts, but we haven't cracked it. And the truth is, this is one of those issues where no religion, no state, no party, no interest group can understand or deal with the problem alone. In order to tackle this issue, we need each other. And we're back to that basic principle of I being I because we are we and you are you. Those are three thoughts which could be multiplied, of course, but seem to me to be among those things which, arising out of a challenge to the mythologies of our day, could just be done. And if we're looking at the priorities we want to push at our leaders and decision makers, I would suggest those aren't bad places to start. And if we do that, maybe we can push through myth into truthfulness, into the right kind of realism, which is corporate and generous and hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you to both our speakers, Michael and Rowan, and to further the conversation on these very important topics, we now ask you to hold up your questions now and over the next 15 to 20 minutes. As they come to you, please write them down, hold them up, and get them collected. Whilst that's happening, and some of the questions are already beginning to come through, but I just wondered if I could ask you about, we had Shamri Chakrabarti here as part of this series, and I'm thinking about human rights. And I just wondered how much you think that perhaps the human rights movement has worked for or against Ubuntu, the stress on the individual over the corporate. Is that a risk? Has that happened? Perhaps we could start with you, Michael.
Sure. I think that's a good nuanced point. Human rights, especially given the civil rights movement in the U.S., really dealt with the problem of, is this only for black people or for Jewish people or for gay and lesbian transgendered people or for women? And I think the wisdom that has come out of the leaders like Martin Luther King and Howard Thurman and others is that when you think of human rights, you're not just thinking about people, you're thinking about creation. And it is a deep problem if it is individualistic perspectives or affinity groups, because all we're doing is perpetuating wars and conflicts. But if we're looking at human rights in a larger picture of creation, and how not only, as Rowan said, we're not only just dealing with myths, but we're having to deal with the hard work of what's really going on with human rights. And so I would say currently we're still struggling with that in the US, for example. There are some African Americans who've had difficult times allowing the discourse of civil rights to be applied to gay and lesbian groups, or even to some women. And I think that side has not come to grips with how we are all interrelated, and if we don't get this right in terms of the larger picture creation, we just we slip and slide right back down to the same aggregation of conflict. Mm-hmm. But I want to say one thing about my president, Barack Obama. It was a deeply courageous move for him to come out for an identity at that time which was not going to be very helpful for his campaign for gay and lesbian people, and to say that he's had some struggle with it and he's had to really try to find out what his own heart was saying, and that he could not be black and have integrity and not make human rights and civil rights applicable across the board. So I think that's an example of how leadership can really influence the larger body.
Thank you. Rowan, do you have...
Just a very brief remark about human rights. If the language of human rights didn't exist, we would have to invent it, because it has played a very significant part, and still does, in the way we challenge outrageous injustice across the world. But in order for it to have vitality and depth, it needs to be inseparable from a discourse of human dignity. That is, it's not just about what I can claim, it's about what is due to everyone in terms of reverence, in terms of positive expectation, in terms of selfless attention. That's what dignity requires. And I just want to see those two things coming a bit more together.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the questions that are coming in. Let's begin. The first here. For many groups, the identity of their members is deeply defined by the conviction that they are not members of certain other groups. I'm me because I'm not you. In fact, they feel they are better than them and have a grievance against them, and are fulfilled when the others are defeated and frustrated. Since these values are often built into centuries of history, cultural symbols and institutions, how do we begin to change this? Rowan, would you like to?
Thank you. A massive question, but I think that what it reveals, or what it points to, is the way in which actually some of the symbols and histories that we think we're confident in, we're treating as if they were very weak. My identity is so fragile, our identity is so fragile, that it demands that I keep the other at arm's length or keep them down. Give these people a chance, and they'll be all over us. How many times do we hear that kind of argument? Wonderfully expressed in C.S. Lewis's remark about bullying at school, where he says the justification of bullying at his public school was that if the older boys didn't keep the younger boys in their place, the younger boys would be all over, they'd take over. Which, of course, they did when they got to be older. And Lewis says it's rather like saying that the frail and trembling wolves have to be protected from the ravening sheep. That we project onto others a threat to ourselves. And that suggests we're actually deeply unconfident about who we are. Getting beyond that and having the right kind of confidence in who we are ought to generate generosity towards the other, and that's what I think we have to work at. Explore your own tradition and identity by all means, so as to discover a deeper trust in it, and that will build bridges.
Now, you talk about this theme a lot in your book on Ubuntu. Perhaps you could just give your insights here.
I think oftentimes groups that define themselves over against others need a crisis. They need something that transcends this definition process of knowing the other as, or characterizing the other or in negative ways. So, for example, politically in the U.S., with the Democrats and Republicans, when Chris Christie had Hurricane Sandy, it looks like that has placed him in the position of running for president now because of how he was able to galvanize otherwise people at war, parties at war, defined over and against the other. But he wouldn't have been able to do that without a crisis. And I think, unfortunately, we need that as human beings. If we could be more mature, we wouldn't have to wait for crisis, or we wouldn't have to procrastinate for how we can do something together. We wouldn't have to wait to the last minute to get things accomplished. But there is something in human nature that is about procrastination in which we have to have a frame of reference to know when to do it and why to do it. So crisis may not be so bad in and of itself outside of the suffering and the catastrophes that we have to deal with. So I would say that we need those, again, not just leaders that we say and hold up against in front of us to say that give us an excuse not to really engage in human society ourselves, not just presidents or senators or whoever, but we need to see this in our own lives, that oftentimes we need a crisis to work with those that we hate or those who have long histories of being our antagonists, to be wise about crisis, to manage it, and not just to wait for it.
So, don't let a good crisis go to waste.
Exactly right.
Two questions I'm going to put together for your response. The first is, living in London, I feel so far from any real sense of community, from your communal participation you were talking about in health terms. I feel so far from any real sense of community. How can we begin to make any of this happen? The second question, how can we apply collective behavior in Western culture that totally is structured to celebrate the success of the singular person? I think they're connected here, but I'm putting them together for you just to reflect on those themes. Rowan.
How to create community in London? Well, I wish I had a one-line answer to that. I suppose there are two or three things that come to mind immediately. One is the obvious one of searching out in some way what the common challenges or needs are in your immediate neighborhood. Are there things that affect everybody, that challenge everybody? Because if so, there is going to be a chance, building on the crisis point, that something might coalesce around that. And I think that is how community organizing in East London has flourished and worked over many years now to very good effect. The other thing is, again, horribly obvious, and I must apologize for saying it, but that is cultivate your friends. Very often we're in environments where the pressure is to have a style of life, a timetable which doesn't give much time for friendship and the making and cultivating of friends. And I speak here with a bitter sense of how bad I am at it. But that is one thing we can do. Doubtless there's lots more, but those are just some immediate thoughts that spring to mind here. And as for how we celebrate the singular, yes, it probably begins, doesn't it, in education. It begins in how we approach life in schools, whether or not we expect schools to produce the right number of ticked boxes and the right number of sausages from the machine, or whether our educational system is really patient enough and imaginative enough to discern particular concerns and gifts and let them be nourished. I certainly want to come at it by that educational route, at least to begin with.
Thank you.
Rowan mentioned community organizing. The techniques around community organizing basically are getting people to tell their stories. And just by virtue of telling a story, you're invited into that story. Just by virtue of your response and your eye contact, you're in that person's story, and lo and behold, the story grows, and there is a common identity in this community. At least in the United States, we've practiced that with sporting events, and people fight over having stadiums and telling the stories of the Philadelphia Eagles or whatever, but we need to have deeper ways in which we are organizing community. So we have the habits in place, but we need to, I think, as Ron was saying, move beyond the superficial into the deeper ways of forming community. I think in terms of celebrating the singular, one of the things about Ubuntu, and perhaps this will come up in our questions, the criticism, the critique of Ubuntu is it seems to belittle the individual or belittle uniqueness. But in fact, Ubuntu accentuates uniqueness, because if you don't have the community, you wouldn't know you're beautiful. If there wasn't the communal framework, language would be unintelligible. Without community, you wouldn't laugh at my African parrot joke. There has to be a frame of reference that provides uniqueness. And so I think the celebration of the singular, it doesn't need to see itself over and against community. It has to understand the dynamics in place to really understand what it means to be an individual and what it needs to be unique. You can't know that without others helping you to move into a deeper way of knowing yourself.
Question can come in. How do you get the best of healthy competition for, the innovation of technology, for instance, within a framework of community? So where's competition in all this? And would you like to begin on that?
I think we've seen in the Arab Springs and many of the revolutions that have taken place on our planet, how technology can be useful to bring people out in the face of injustice. And I know those who are around the new trade, the stock of tweeting, they've taken advantage of that. So in some ways, technology has been useful to bring people together against injustice. I think the problem with technology is how can you use it in ways in which it sustains people, not just in punctiliar events and events that naturally bring people together, but how can you use technology to help people grow in the downtime? Because technology has created a way in which we are on 24/7. We have access to each other and to ourselves 24/7, and that use of technology doesn't help us to grow. As one of the great psychoanalysts, D.W. Winnicott, said, if a child is going to be able to grow, has to be able to negotiate boredom, has to be able to negotiate stimuli and not chase after it all the time. And so I think that's the problem with technology, and the ways that technology can help us is how can some of these companies and great minds that are hurting us with technology, how can they also help us to say, turn it off? How can they help us to maximize the contrast of when technology is useful?
Mm-hmm. Let me come at it from another point of view and come back to the question of competition. It seems to me that one of our difficulties is that we always tend to think of competition as a zero-sum game. Somebody wins, somebody loses. Competition as something which stimulates every person in a shared enterprise seems to me healthy and solid. And as we know, there are industrial and other concerns which seem to understand how that works. In some of the great periods of technological advance, you don't have a sense that somebody was seeking to elbow into someone else's space. but that there was a real awareness that there was some common agenda which was being pushed forward by a proper kind of almost game-like competition between people. It's something seen also in the scientific community at its best, where a really great scientist can often say, well, someone has got to the solution of this before me, and how wonderful we've now got the solution we can all use, rather than, damn it, I didn't get there first. And it's breaking through that simple alternation of winners and losers.
Now, you talked about managing boredom. There's a question here about General Synod.
Can't see the connection.
Actually, there are two questions that have come in about the church. So I just want to bring this up because I think that's important in this environment. The first question says, Ubuntu is about truth talking and helping people to be heard into healing. What role has the church got here? That's the first. Second is a little bit more focused. Does the panel think that Ubuntu techniques might help General Synod to move closer to ordaining women as bishops this week? Would you like to start?
Yes, I'll let Rowan answer the second one. I think the church has a huge role. As I said, I think given the very architecture of the church's way of behaving and thinking, feeling, we have the narrative of the very image of God as Ubuntu. Unlike some of the other, I like the word myths that Rowan has used, that God is an individual or God is a man upstairs. The image of God is really community. One God, but the nature of God is in three persons, so interdependently seen and related that these persons make us see one God. The church, if the church can really grasp the beauty, the aesthetics of that, and then grasp the ethics of it, we should be leaders in bringing people together and not separating them and not sending people to hell. I think the church also, for good and ill, back to Constantine, the church has been involved with politics. And how we engage in politics in the 21st century has to be renegotiated. The churches these days are the healthiest, are those that are marginalized in many political regimes. Those churches seem to be the healthiest. They seem to have the best leaders. And I think we can learn from them why those churches are the healthier ones instead of those that are seen as civil religion. So Ubuntu, to me, is a natural corollary of being a church and practicing the church.
One of the difficulties that the first question makes me think of is that for people to be heard into healing, which is a fine phrase, they need to know that it's safe for them to speak. And one of the toughest questions the church has to take on board and ask itself is the church a safe place for people to speak about their experiences? We have all sorts of unhappy experience of the church's failure in that respect. And I think that's just one of the most painful questions we have to keep before ourselves. Are we actually creating a place where it is safe for people to speak about their doubts, about their brokenness, about experiences of abuse, about experiences of disadvantage? And it does cost to make the church such a community, but otherwise we won't be capable of the healing work. Ideally, I think, and I'm just, dreaming in a sense here, ideally the church exists at its fullest in two modes. The one is where it is simply adoring and worshipping God the Holy Trinity. The church at the Eucharist, the church giving thanks, the church praising, just doing what human beings were made to do. And the other focus is where the church is, at whatever cost, making space, making room for the actual human experience, however complicated, however apparently unacceptable, however broken, to come in and be heard. Unfortunately, most of our energies in the church go somewhere in between those. Neither worship nor listening, neither really attending to God nor really attending to people. That's the curse of so much of our institutional life. It may be unavoidable, but there it is, it's a problem. And I think in connection to the second problem, second question, I've certainly found over the years that a challenge in the life of General Synod or any body like that is to create at least some structures in which people can meet not as voters, not as arguers, but as disciples. And that, of course, is another way of talking about Ubuntu. I suppose in the Lambeth Conference of 2008, to use the other great South African word, Indaba, we were trying to create an environment where people could be guaranteed a hearing, and it wouldn't just be a matter of horse trading and decision-making. So I'm very glad that my successor has done so much, an amazing amount, in the last year to take forward that spirit and that willingness to engage and have expert people help facilitate that sort of encounter. I hope and pray that Synod goes on developing a bit more in that line.
You talk about your successor, and we're in the City of London here. A couple of questions have come through on this theme, and it's a theme that your successor has taken up with great power. Why did society miss the opportunity of the financial crisis to reevaluate our values and sense of community? Do you think we can reclaim the opportunity of that crisis for positive challenges, or has the moment passed?
Well, being a person of faith, I only have one answer. Of course, there is the possibility. I think unless we develop relationships with those who are of different socioeconomic backgrounds, we'll continue with rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. We need to develop relationships with those who are different, not just see them in theory and see them through our windows or driving down the street. We have to actually be in relationship with those who are poor. And I would imagine that's the contrast for most of us in the room, that we need to be in relationship with those who are poor. And then that gives us the narrative, the community organizing, the ways in which we can then really have practical answers for moving forward. And as Rowan said, to implement some very, to me, no-brainer. Of course, I'm from the US, but no-brainer types of answers of using these sort of transactional taxes and so on that Rowan outlined.
Because it seems to me that you can't just talk yourself out of something you've behaved yourself into. So there has to be behavioral change here, surely.
Yes, and behavioral change is difficult, and it's particularly difficult when you're dealing with immense global organizations whose focus for change, whose leverage for change, is quite hard to identify sometimes. In the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, I find myself talking quite a lot with people in the city, mostly in not very public contexts, but we had a series of fairly intense meetings. And there was always a little bit of a tendency to say, well, of course, we, the younger people in the financial services industry, would like to see change, but the culture of the older generation is not with us. And there were people at the top of their organizations who said, well, of course, we grew up in a much more morally robust environment, and it's these younger people who create the problem. And I kept thinking, how do we connect these perceptions somehow in a way that can help us identify where the levers really are? And needless to say, neither I nor anybody else seems to have cracked that. But it's not just Well, it certainly isn't, the innate wickedness of people in the square mile. It is something to do with this cumbersome, complex, diverse set of institutions which are incapable of changing rapidly and often incapable of recognizing how change is consciously, intentionally brought about. But I don't lose hope.
Often in these events, you can sort of sense a positive restlessness amongst a lot of people here wanting the change and wanting to know, what can we do? You've given us good ideas, now what? And there's a question here, I think, that comes out of that sort of positive frustration. How can we set up groups in our own areas to continue Ubuntu? How can we cast off our dependence on leaders whom we perceive to be the prime movers, but actually we are? So, Michael.
I think one way, Mark, is to try to be healthy, to try to be well. Based on what I was saying about what social science is teaching us, that when we're trying to be healthy, we can't help but enter into the framework of Ubuntu. When we're trying to take care of our bodies, we can only do that through a framework of understanding the interdependence of myself and my needs with someone who can help me. For example, when I try to swim twice a week, and I'm usually the very slow swimmer, and they have a lane just for me swimming. And when I was swimming one day, I saw someone standing up on the deck, and I thought it was the lifeguard saying that I was still too slow to move over. But the lifeguard, being out of the water, being out of my environment, pulled me over, and he said, do you know when you're swimming, you're moving your arm too far over to the right, and you're defeating your body? And if you can learn, even though it may not feel right, to keep your left arm to the left, that will help you in terms of your exercise. And I thought to myself, if I didn't have this other person outside of my perspective, I would still be doing something in an unhealthy way. I would probably be more frustrated. I'd probably stop swimming. And I think that's an analogy for, how can we actually do something? And that is, we need to be able to be healthy, for one thing, but we also need to be in relationships with others that we can share our gifts, our perspectives, and have safe enough space, as Rowan said, to be able to share that without that being perceived as a threat. So it goes both ways. We need to be healthy, but we also need to be providing health. And also think we can practice Ubuntu practically as we're doing now, creating ways of gathering, of simply being together and not trying to vote on something or trying to solve some crisis, but just by virtue that you are listening to us, we are doing some community organizing. We're telling our stories up here, but you're also receiving these stories, and hopefully you will tell the stories that you have learned from tonight, and we don't know where this is going to go. But learning how to be together, not simply to try to vote on something or to fix something, but to be together, is a way in which the framework of Ubuntu becomes real.
Storytelling is so important in this context because it reveals meaning, but without falling into the trap of defining it. So the meaning is shared. Is that?
And will depend on each other.
Yes.
To know the larger meaning.
Thank you.
I think that there are already various kinds of local cooperation which we ought to be supporting practically, whether it's credit unions or food cooperatives, the community organizing movement. There are options there. I think we need to put energy into those. But I think we also need, as Michael was saying, to create the sort of space where ideas can be shared. And one thing that struck me very forcibly some years ago, well, quite a few years ago now, when I was still a bishop in Wales, was that when we had a general election campaign, the local churches throughout South Wales made a point of organising hustings for candidates, actual public meetings where actual human beings were asked actual human questions. Now, political campaigning in our age has become so much a matter of smoke and mirrors and pseudo-celebrity promotion that it's really quite difficult for people to come and answer human questions from human beings. So when we have another general election, I'd just like to suggest that everybody pressurizes as much as possible their local church or whatever other institution they're involved in to do just that.
A couple of questions just wanting clarification on how can we be more emotionally intelligent? I think we all feel we want to be, but can you give us a lesson?
Oh, you know, deep breathing and that sort of thing. Well, this could take a long time to talk about, and I don't want to claim to be any sort of an expert. But what I'm probing for, I think, is a willingness to stop and look at how we're feeling. There's a big difference between lashing out and saying, I'm angry. And that's a very small thing, but it's the beginning of understanding that my immediate upsurge of feeling is not, as I said, the be-all and end-all. I'm angry. I'm impatient. I'm lustful. I'm greedy. Okay, stop and look. As it were, put it on the table in front of you and say, yeah, that's how I'm feeling. That's what we have language for. It's to put things where we can see them, and where others can as well. Because the next step may be to say to somebody else, actually, I'm angry. Can we talk about this? Rather than just, as I say, lashing out and assuming my anger gives me the right to do what I choose. And looking back on it, I can say, oh, well, a red mist came over my eyes. So that's a beginning of emotional intelligence, and it means, I think, a willingness to take time between the first sensing of an emotion and what we do about it. And that requires a discipline of some inner stillness, the willingness to give yourself that space to look. And it's rather like what one of the 4th century monastic writers says about temptation. He says, of course, the first thing you've got to do is register that this is the feeling that's there. Don't lie about it, don't evade it, don't deny it, it's there. But the crucial question is, are you then going to indulge it? Are you going to invite it in, explore it, let it sort of leak all over the place? Or are you going to look at it, pray with it, work with it? And that's a start.
Because in many ways, the ego is that part of us that's rather wedded to the status quo.
Absolutely.
And yes. Meeting another makes you vulnerable to have to perhaps change, yes. Which is why it's painful but necessary. Yes. Time, I'm afraid, has come to an end, but there's a last question here, which I hope it might prompt you into a final thought, not only for this forum, but for our whole series. We humans are diverse, divisive, and difficult. What's the glue that holds us all together? You can go first.
Well, I think I want to steal one of Rowan's words that he used, which is overused by all of us, and it's love. And it's similar to Ubuntu in the sense that we really don't know what it is. But I think until we can be in a relationship in which we discover love, and I don't think anyone wakes up one morning and says, I'm going to love you. I think love has to be discovered. And as we discover it, I think that's the glue. That's what keeps us together. That's what allows the anger to come in and out of the relationship without destroying the relationship. That's what creates safety. And as a Christian, we believe that's also God. The quantum physics way of saying that God particle of holding us together really would be love. And I think love has to be that way in terms of it has to be that ineffable, has to have that ineffable aspect of not really being able to define it very well. But I think if we're going to be a community, we have to practice what we're doing here. We go back to what I'm saying, and this is my last word. Is that right, Mark?
Mm-hmm.
I would...
Now or never.
I would say that we need to be like South Africa in terms of practicing creative ways of gathering. For a long time, they could not, as a black South African or a colored South African, could not gather together in public without a pass or card, so they gathered creatively. And I think that's the mandate for all of us. If we're going to help heal some of these ills in our society, there has to be some creative gathering around the ills of society, both physical gathering as well as emotional intelligence, mental, political, economic, gathering around these situations like T cells, trying to help whatever the disease is to move out or to help adapt to helping us as a body. And I think I've learned recently in biology that there are microbes and bacteria that we actually need in order to be healthy. So those people who cause us dis-ease, those issues that cause us dis-ease, actually could be helpful for us, like bacteria, if we can learn how to gather around them and use them for the purposes of all of humanity, not just for some of us.
Thank you. Rowan.
I suppose that for me the glue is the common situation of embodied persons in a material world. All of us faced with the challenges that involves, and the all-important extra dimension that I would see as a Christian believer, all of us here because we are summoned into being by a completely gratuitous, free love that values each one of us for what we are. So we recognize in one another a person summoned, invited into being. And the question to me is, so how do I approach them invitingly? I recognize in them the same complex of challenges and gifts that I face. I recognize that we are creatures together, that the concerns, to lower the tone, the concerns with food, sex, and death that are universal for human beings are felt by both of us. And it's too small a world to build impregnable walls between people who share that sort of condition.
Well, it's nearly 8 o'clock, time for food and sex, but hopefully not death. Dear, this is being filmed, isn't it? Oh dear. I'll never get that job. It seems right that we've been discussing this theme in a cathedral where the Dean, John Donne, 1621, wrote that no man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And I just want to thank, on your behalf, both our speakers this evening. Jimi Hendrix, it was, I think, who said that in order to change the world, you first have to get your head together. And I think this series has been trying to, for some of us, get our heads together. But then we know that's only part one, and part two is what happens when you leave those doors. And the quotation there that struck me comes from Tutu himself, where he said that do your little bit of good wherever you are. It's those little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world. And that, I believe, is the reason why we assemble in these forums. And these forums would be nothing if we didn't have speakers of the quality we've had this evening. And on your behalf, I'd like to thank both Rowan Williams and Michael Battle. Thank you. Thank you.